An original podcast from podlatino.com.
In 1986, the world had placed its faith in technology. The decades before had left behind a shared certainty. Humanity could build machines that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Rockets that escaped gravity. Reactors that generated enough energy to power entire cities. Progress seemed like a straight line with no end. That year, the line broke twice. Once in the sky, once on the ground. But 1986 was not only a year of catastrophe. It was also the year an Argentine soccer player scored 2 goals that people are still arguing about today. The year the Philippines ended a dictatorship without firing a single shot. And the year Reagan and Gorbachev sat across from each other in a frozen city to talk about ending the war that had defined the world for decades. Tragedy and history shared a calendar, as they always do. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral with 7 people on board. 73 seconds later, it exploded in the air. The entire world watched, because the mission was being broadcast live on television. Millions of people, many of them students sitting in their classrooms, witnessed the disaster in real time. The cause was a failure in a rubber seal on one of the solid rocket boosters, which could not withstand the cold temperatures of that morning. Engineers had warned about the risk. The decision to launch anyway was an institutional failure, not just a technical one. What made this mission especially painful was who was on board. Among the 7 astronauts was Krista McAuliffe, a teacher from New Hampshire who had been selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first ordinary citizen to travel to space. Her presence was a statement. Space was no longer just the territory of military personnel or elite scientists. It belonged to everyone. That promise broke apart, along with the shuttle. President Reagan canceled the State of the Union address he had planned for that same evening and spoke to the nation in a message that became historic. NASA's human spaceflight program was grounded for nearly 3 years. Challenger was not the end of space exploration, but it was the end of a certain innocence about its risks. 3 months later, in the early hours of April 26th, an explosion tore through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, in what was then the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. The accident began during a safety test that spiraled completely out of control. The reactor core overheated, triggered an explosive reaction, and released radioactive material into the air that spread across Europe. It was not a nuclear explosion in the sense of a bomb, but its consequences were devastating. What followed immediately was an official response defined by secrecy. Soviet authorities took hours to begin evacuations and days to publicly acknowledge what had happened. The city of Pripyat, built to house the plant's workers, was evacuated roughly 36 hours after the accident. Its 50,000 residents had to leave everything behind. Many believed it would be temporary. They never returned. The first responders, firefighters, and workers who had no real understanding of what they were dealing with died in the weeks that followed from acute radiation exposure. The exact number of long-term deaths attributable to the disaster remains a matter of scientific debate. But the consequences for human health, agriculture, soil, and water stretched across decades and across borders. For the Western world, Chernobyl was also a political signal. The Soviet government's initial silence stood in sharp contrast to the radioactive cloud that crossed national boundaries without asking permission. Countries across Central and Northern Europe detected abnormal radiation levels on their own soil before Moscow admitted the true scale of the disaster. The accident damaged the image of a superpower that presented itself as a model of industrial and scientific progress. And it raised, with brutal clarity, the question of what happens when technology fails at a scale that human systems of control simply cannot contain. While Europe was processing the impact of Chernobyl, the World Cup was being played in Mexico. The choice of venue was not a minor detail. Mexico had been struck by a devastating earthquake in September 1985, with thousands of deaths and cities left partially destroyed. Hosting a global tournament just months later was itself a signal of recovery. The World Cup was magnificent, drawing teams from across the globe and turning Mexico into the center of the soccer world for several weeks. Argentina arrived with a strong squad and Diego Maradona at the peak of his career. The quarterfinal match against England was one of the most charged with meaning in the history of the sport. The two countries had gone to war 4 years earlier over the Falkland Islands, a conflict that left hundreds dead and wounds that had not healed. Soccer did not replace politics, but in that stadium, on that afternoon, the tension between the two nations moved onto the field in a way that no other sport could have contained in quite the same way. In that match, the two most talked-about goals of the 20th century were scored. The first, Maradona put in with his left hand, on a play the referee missed entirely. Maradona himself later described it with a phrase that became part of global folklore, saying it was a little with his head and a little with the hand of God. The second came 4 minutes later and was something else entirely. Maradona picked up the ball in his own half, dribbled past 5 English players in a 60-meter run, and finished. Decades later, experts voted it the greatest goal in World Cup history. Argentina won that game and advanced all the way to the final, where they defeated West Germany. The trophy went to Buenos Aires. That same year, 12,000 miles from Mexico, the Philippines was experiencing one of the most surprising political shifts of the decade. Ferdinand Marcos had been in power for more than 20 years, running a regime defined by corruption and repression. The elections of February 1986 were widely considered fraudulent. The opposition, led by Corazon Aquino, the widow of assassinated opposition leader Benigno Aquino, called for civil mobilization. For 4 days, hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of Manila, forming a human chain in front of troops loyal to Marcos. The crowd prayed, sang, and offered flowers to the soldiers. The military did not fire. Marcos fled to exile in Hawaii. It became known as the People Power Revolution, and it was studied as a model around the world for years to come. In October of that year, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland, for a summit that came remarkably close to changing the history of nuclear arms. The two leaders got further than anyone had before toward an agreement to eliminate long-range nuclear missiles from both sides. The talks fell apart at the last moment over disagreement about the American space-based missile defense program known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. But the fact that they had come that close was significant in itself. The Cold War was still standing, but its internal structure had started to creak. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union launched the Mir space station, which would spend the next 15 years orbiting Earth and becoming a symbol of Soviet endurance in space, even as the country's internal pressures continued to mount. On screens and through speakers, 1986 had its own sound and image. Top Gun-packed movie theaters with fighter jets and electric guitars. Madonna released True Blue. Bon Jovi put out Slippery When Wet, one of the best-selling rock albums of the decade. Television and music videos kept reshaping how popular culture was consumed around the world. Video games were advancing steadily. The home market was expanding, consoles were reaching more households, and a new generation was growing up treating interactive entertainment as completely normal. 1986 left a deep mark precisely because It combined things that rarely sit together in the same collective memory: horror and glory, the paralysis of fear and the euphoria of a packed stadium, visible institutional failure and the dignity of those who responded without fully knowing what they were facing. That year, the world looked up and found wreckage in the sky. It looked inside a reactor and found what it had preferred not to see. But it also looked at a soccer field and witnessed something people still describe as magic. And it looked at a crowd in Manila and saw that it was possible to change the course of a country without firing a single shot. All of that happened in 12 months. That is what makes 1986 a year that stays with you.